The letter said she was plain. That's the word she used. Plain. Ordinary. Nothing worth looking twice at. She wrote it 3 times across 6 letters, as if she needed him to understand, to truly, deeply understand, that the woman stepping off that stagecoach would not turn heads. She said she had mousy hair, a forgettable face, and hands made rough by years of scrubbing other people's floors. She said she was grateful. Grateful that a man like Caleb Thornton, a man with 200 acres and a house with rail glass windows, would even consider a woman like her. Caleb liked that. He liked grateful. He'd buried his first wife 14 months ago, and he didn't need beauty. He needed someone steady. Someone who wouldn't ask too many questions about the bruises on his knuckles, or why certain men crossed the street when they saw him coming, or why the locked room at the end of the hallway stayed locked. So when the stagecoach pulled into Stillwater, Arizona territory, on that scorching July afternoon in 1887, Caleb stood at the depot with his hat in his hands and his expectations low. Then the door opened, and the woman who stepped out nearly stopped his heart. She wasn't plain. She wasn't ordinary. She wasn't anything close to forgettable. She was the kind of beautiful that made a man's mouth go dry and his thoughts go dark, the kind of beautiful that carried danger in every curve, in every glance, in every breath. And standing there in the white-hot sun, Caleb Thornton felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not fear of her, exactly. Fear of himself. Fear of what a woman like that could make a man like him do. Fear of the wanting that had already begun crawling through his chest like a rattlesnake uncoiling from its den. Something was very, very wrong. No woman that beautiful would ever need to answer a mail-order bride advertisement. No woman that beautiful would travel 1,200 miles to marry a stranger in a dust-choked town at the edge of nowhere. Unless she was running from something worse. What would you have done? Would you have sent her back? Or would you have taken her hand, looked into those devastating eyes, and walked straight into whatever hell she was carrying with her? Caleb took her hand. She said her name was Elara Finch. She said it quietly, almost apologetically, as if the name itself was a confession. Her voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that belonged to a woman who had learned a long time ago that speaking softly kept you alive longer than shouting. Caleb loaded her single trunk into the back of his wagon without a word. It was light. Too light. A woman traveling 1,200 miles to start a new life should have more than what fit in a trunk that weighed less than a sack of grain. He noticed, but he didn't ask. Asking questions wasn't something Caleb Thornton did. He collected observations the way other men collected debts, silently, patiently, and with the full intention of using them when the time came. The ride from town to his ranch took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of dust and heat and the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels. 40 minutes during which Caleb kept his eyes on the road and fought the almost physical urge to look at her. He lost that fight twice. The first time, she was gazing at the landscape, the endless scrubland, the red rock mesas shimmering in the distance, the sky so blue it looked like it could shatter. Her profile was sharp and clean, like something carved from alabaster. A thin scar traced along her jawline, barely visible, mostly hidden by the way she angled her face. It was the kind of scar a knife left. A small knife, held close. The second time he looked, she was already looking at him. Their eyes met for exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Caleb saw intelligence. Calculation. And beneath that, buried so deep most men would have missed it entirely, he saw terror. She looked away first. "Your letters were kind," she said. "I meant them to be. You described the ranch. The land. The house. You never described yourself. Didn't see the need. You're younger than I expected." Caleb was 34. His face looked 40. The territory did that to men, aged them like leather left in the sun. His hands were scarred across every knuckle, and his right ear carried a notch where a bullet had clipped it 6 years ago during a disagreement over cattle that had turned into a disagreement over living and dying. And you, he said carefully, are not what I expected either. She stiffened. Just barely. A tightening across her shoulders that lasted half a breath. I told you I was plain. You did. You don't believe me. I believe you wrote what you needed to write to get on that stagecoach. Silence. Long and heavy, filled with the sound of hooves on packed dirt, and the distant cry of a hawk circling something dying in the scrub. Will you send me back? She whispered. Caleb considered the question. He considered the scar on her jaw, the too light trunk, the terror living behind her eyes. He considered the way his pulse quickened when the wind shifted and he caught the scent of her, soap and sage and something underneath that was purely, dangerously female. No, he said. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a small fortress carved out of the desert. A 2-story house built from local stone, a barn, a corral holding 6 horses, and beyond that, 200 acres of land that stretched toward the Dragoon Mountains. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. Defensible. Caleb had built it that way on purpose. He helped her down from the wagon. Her hand was small in his, and her grip was stronger than it should have been. When her boots hit the ground, she looked at the house, at the thick stone walls and the narrow windows and the heavy oak door, and something changed in her expression. Relief. Pure, desperate relief, as if she had been drowning and someone had finally thrown her a rope. It looks like a fort, she said. It was designed to be. She turned to him then, and for the first time, she almost smiled. Good. He showed her through the house. The kitchen with its iron stove. The sitting room with a stone fireplace. The bedroom upstairs that would be hers. He would sleep in the room off the kitchen, as he'd explained in his letters. Propriety until the wedding, which Reverend Calloway would perform on Sunday. She asked about the locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway. Storage, he said. She didn't press. And Caleb noted that too. A woman who didn't press about locked doors was either extraordinarily polite, or intimately familiar with the kind of secrets that required locks. That night Caleb sat on the front porch with a glass of whiskey and his Winchester across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the property line. He did this every night. Had done it every night since Margaret died. Some men grieved. Some men guarded what was left. From inside the house, he heard her footsteps. Soft, careful, deliberate. She was walking the rooms. Not exploring, mapping. Learning the layout the way a person learned an escape route. Caleb took a long drink of whiskey and stared into the dark. What had he brought into his house? The wedding was scheduled for Sunday, which gave them 4 days to exist together as strangers sharing a roof. 4 days of careful distance, measured conversations, and the constant, thrumming awareness that filled every room they occupied simultaneously. Elara threw herself into the work of the house with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She scrubbed floors that were already clean. She reorganized the pantry. She cooked meals that were surprisingly sophisticated, roasted chicken with herbs he couldn't name, bread that rose high and golden, a stew that made him close his eyes with the first spoonful. Where did you learn to cook like this? He asked on the second evening. I worked in a hotel kitchen. In San Francisco. San Francisco's a long way from Arizona. That was the idea. On the third morning, Caleb needed to ride into Stillwater for supplies. He asked if she wanted to come. He expected her to say no. She'd barely left the house since arriving, and when she stood near the windows, she stood to the side. Looking out at angles rather than straight on, the way someone stands when they're worried about being seen from outside. But she surprised him. Yes, she said. I'll come. She wore a plain cotton dress the color of dust, and she'd pulled her hair back tight beneath a bonnet that shadowed her face. It was a disguise, Caleb realized. A deliberate attempt to be less visible, less memorable. But it didn't work. Nothing could make that face invisible. Stillwater was a town of 300 souls clinging to existence at the junction of 2 mining roads. It had a general store, a saloon called the Copper Strike, a church, an assayer's office, a barber shop, and a jail that saw more use than any building except the saloon. The sheriff was a man named Dale Whitaker, thick, slow, and dangerously stupid in the way that made him unpredictable, because you could never quite tell which brand of stupidity he'd deploy next. They rode in just before noon. The town was sluggish in the heat, most people pressed against shaded walls or huddled inside buildings. Caleb pulled the wagon up to Morrison's general store and helped Elara down. Inside the store, Agnes Morrison, a widow with a face like cracked leather and eyes that missed nothing, watched Elara the way a hawk watches a mouse. Not with hostility, exactly. With intense, almost predatory curiosity. "So you're the mail-order bride," Agnes said. "I am. You're not what anyone expected." "So I've been told." Agnes looked at Caleb. Something passed between them, a question from her, a warning from him. Agnes had known Caleb for 8 years. She'd known Margaret. She'd seen the bruises Margaret sometimes wore like dark flowers on her arms and face, and she'd said nothing because in Stillwater, saying something about Caleb Thornton was a luxury that could cost you dearly. "Well," Agnes said, turning back to her shelves. "Welcome to Stillwater." They were loading the wagon when the door to the copper strike swung open and a man stepped out into the sunlight. He was tall, lean, dressed in black from his hat to his boots, and he wore a silver badge pinned to his vest that identified him as a deputy U.S. Marshal. His name was Ezekiel Brand. He was 38 years old, and he had the cold, patient eyes of a man who hunted people for a living. He stood on the saloon's porch, rolling a cigarette with practiced fingers, and he watched the wagon with the kind of focus that made the air feel heavier. Caleb saw him. His hands tightened on the reins. Elara saw him too. And her reaction was the thing that cracked the careful composure she'd maintained since stepping off that stagecoach. Her face went white. Absolutely, completely white, as if every drop of blood had drained from her body in a single instant. Her hand shot out and gripped Caleb's forearm with a strength that surprised him. "Drive," she whispered. "What?" "Please." "Drive. Now." Caleb drove. He didn't rush. Rushing drew attention, but he kept the horses moving at a steady pace until they cleared the edge of town and the dust swallowed them. They were 2 miles out before she let go of his arm. Her fingers had left marks. "You know that man?" Caleb said. Not a question. Silence. "Elara." "I don't know him." Her voice was thin, strained. "But I know what he is. And I know what men like that want. He's a federal marshal." "Yes." "Are you in trouble with the law?" She turned to face him. And in her eyes he saw not guilt but something infinitely more complex, a mixture of defiance and exhaustion and the desperate, cornered fury of an animal that has been running so long it has forgotten what it feels like to stand still. "I am not a criminal," she said. "But the man who is looking for me, the man who may have sent that marshal, he will tell you I am. He will tell you many things about me, Caleb. And some of them will even be true." The wagon creaked through the silence that followed. "Who is looking for you?" "My husband." The word hit like a bullet. Caleb's jaw tightened. His knuckles went white on the reins. "You're married." "I was." "I am." "Legally." She swallowed. "He's not a man you leave. He's not a man who lets you leave." "But I left anyway, and I have been running for 7 months. And I am so tired of running that I answered your advertisement, and lied about my face because I thought no one would ever look for a plain woman in a place like this." The ranch came into view ahead. Caleb stared at it, his fortress, his stone walls, his narrow windows. "What's your husband's name?" he asked quietly. "Victor Ashworth." Caleb pulled the reins. The wagon stopped. The horses snorted and stamped in the dust. He knew that name. Everyone west of the Mississippi knew that name. Victor Ashworth, railroad magnate, political kingmaker, one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in California. A man who owned judges the way other men owned horses. A man whose enemies had a peculiar habit of disappearing. "You're telling me," Caleb said slowly, "that you are the wife of Victor Ashworth?" "Yes." "And you came here?" "Yes." Caleb stared at the horizon for a long time. Then he picked up the reins and drove the wagon home. That night, Caleb didn't sit on the porch. He paced the kitchen like a caged animal, his mind working through the implications the way a man works through the chambers of a revolver, one by one, each loaded, each capable of killing him. Victor Ashworth's wife. He had Victor Ashworth's wife sleeping upstairs in his house. A man who could buy armies. A man who could send marshals and bounty hunters and hired killers to the edge of nowhere, and have them tear the territory apart looking for one woman. A man who did not lose what belonged to him. The smart play was obvious. Send her away. Put her on the next stagecoach heading anywhere, south to Tucson, east to El Paso, it didn't matter. Just get her out of his house, off his land, away from the life he'd built here. The life that depended on no one looking too closely at Caleb Thornton, or the things Caleb Thornton had done before he became a rancher. He poured another whiskey. His third. The amber liquid trembled in the glass, and he realized his hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something worse. Because underneath the calculation, underneath the survival instinct screaming at him to cut her loose, there was the wanting. God help him, the wanting. It had burrowed into him like a splinter under the skin, and every time he looked at her, every time she turned her head and the lamplight caught the architecture of her face, every time her voice dropped to that low, steady register that seemed designed to unravel him, the splinter drove deeper. He wanted her. He wanted her the way a drowning man wants air. And that wanting terrified him because Caleb Thornton knew, better than most men alive, what desire could make a man become. He knew because of Margaret. Margaret, his first wife, who had been sweet and quiet and obedient, who had loved him in the beginning and feared him by the end. Margaret, who had fallen down the stairs one night in November and broken her neck. That was the story. That was what he told the sheriff, what he told the neighbors, what he told himself in the dark hours when the whiskey ran dry and the silence of the house pressed against him like a living thing. It was even mostly true. She had fallen. He just hadn't mentioned the argument that preceded the fall, or the way he'd grabbed her arm at the top of the stairs, or the expression on her face in that final moment, not fear, not anger. But something worse. Disappointment. As if she'd always known it would end this way. Caleb set down the glass. He walked upstairs, past Alara's closed door, past the strip of lamplight glowing beneath it, to the locked room at the end of the hall. He produced a key from his pocket and opened the door. The room was small. It contained a writing desk, a wooden chair, and a trunk. Inside the trunk were the things Margaret had left behind, her letters, her jewelry, a daguerreotype of her family in Pennsylvania, and a leather journal that Caleb had read once and only once. On the night he found it after her funeral. The journal was damning. Page after page in Margaret's careful handwriting, documenting every act of cruelty, every blow, every whispered threat. She had written it as evidence, he realized. Insurance. A record that would speak for her if she could no longer speak for herself. She had hidden it well. Not well enough. He hadn't destroyed it. He didn't know why. Maybe because destroying it felt like killing her a second time. Maybe because some part of him, the part that still remembered being a boy in Ohio who picked wildflowers for his mother, believed he deserved to have the evidence of his sins preserved. A monument to the monster he had become. He closed the trunk, locked the room, stood in the hallway and pressed his forehead against the cool stone wall. From behind Alara's door, he heard a sound. Quiet, muffled, controlled. She was crying. Crying the way people cry when they've had years of practice doing it silently, burying the sound in a pillow, swallowing the sobs before they could fully form. Caleb stood there and listened to a woman cry and felt something shift inside him like tectonic plates grinding against each other far underground. Something that hadn't moved in years. Something that might have been conscience. He went back downstairs. The next morning, he found her in the kitchen at dawn, eyes clear, posture straight, no evidence of the tears. She had made coffee and biscuits, and she set a plate before him with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that usefulness was a form of currency. "I'll leave if you want me to," she said. "I won't blame you. Where would you go?" "I don't know." "How long before he finds you? Without protection?" "Weeks. Maybe less. Victor has resources most men can't imagine." "The marshal in town, if Victor sent him, it means he's narrowed the search to the territory. It's only a matter of time before someone connects the mail-order advertisement to a woman matching my description." "Has he hurt you?" Caleb asked. The irony of the question sat in his mouth like ashes. She pulled down the collar of her dress. Just an inch. Enough to reveal a scar that ran from her collarbone to just below her throat, thick, raised, ugly. Not a knife wound. A burn. The kind of burn a heated fireplace poker leaves. "He will kill me if he finds me," she said, matter of fact. "Not quickly. He's not a quick man. But eventually, yes. He will kill me." She fixed her collar and picked up the coffee pot. "I'll leave today," she said. "Sit down." She looked at him. "Sit down, Elara." She sat. "We're getting married on Sunday," Caleb said. "As planned?" "You don't have to. A wife can't be compelled to testify against her husband. And a husband has legal claim over his wife's residence and protection. If you're my wife, Ashworth's legal standing weakens. It doesn't disappear, but it weakens. A marshal can't just drag a married woman out of her home without paperwork, and paperwork takes time. You're offering to protect me. I'm offering to marry you. That was always the arrangement. The arrangement was for a plain woman with no complications. Plans change." She studied him across the table. Those dark eyes, intelligent, searching, afraid. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this?" "Because I want you," he thought. "Because the want is eating me alive, and maybe if I do something decent for once in my miserable life it will balance the scales. Maybe if I protect you instead of destroy you, I can prove that Margaret was wrong about me. That I'm not what she wrote about in that journal. Because I need a wife," he said. "And you need a husband who isn't Victor Ashworth." She held his gaze for a long time. Then she nodded. Sunday came like a blade being drawn. Reverend Calloway performed the ceremony in the small clapboard church at the center of Stillwater. The pews held a scattered congregation of locals who came less for the wedding and more for the spectacle, the enigmatic rancher and his inexplicably beautiful bride. Agnes Morrison sat in the third row, her eyes moving between Caleb and Elara with an expression that was equal parts concern and morbid fascination. Caleb wore his one good suit. It was black and slightly too tight across the shoulders, and it made him look like what he was, a man of violence dressed up as something civilized. Elara wore a dress the color of cream, borrowed from a trunk Margaret had never unpacked. It fit him perfectly, too loose at the waist, too tight at the bust, but she wore it with a dignity that transformed it. The vows were simple. Standard. Nothing personal, nothing tender. Two strangers entering a legal contract under the watchful eye of God and a dozen curious neighbors. When Calloway said, "You may kiss the bride," Caleb leaned forward and pressed his lips to her forehead, brief, chaste, almost fraternal. But when he pulled back, their eyes met, and the space between them ignited with a heat that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun pouring through the church windows. Her lips parted. His breath caught. For 1 second, the carefully constructed walls between them wavered, and what lurked behind those walls was vast and terrifying and completely mutual. Then the moment passed. They turned to face the congregation. Agnes Morrison's expression had shifted from concern to alarm. The reception, such as it was, took place at the Copper Strike. The owner, a hard-bitten Irishman named Donald Feeney, had set out glasses of whiskey on the bar. The miners and cowboys and drifters who constituted Stillwater's population raised their glasses and drank and went back to their own miseries. That's when Ezekiel Brand appeared. He came through the saloon doors with the unhurried confidence of a man who had entered 1,000 saloons in 100 towns and had never once been intimidated by what he found inside. His badge caught the light. His eyes found Elara immediately, with the precision of a rifle scope locking onto a target. He walked to the bar. He stood 3 feet from Caleb and ordered a whiskey. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you. Beautiful bride." "I think so. Brand's my name. Deputy U.S. Marshal out of San Francisco. Long way from San Francisco, Marshal. The work takes me where it takes me." Brand sipped his whiskey. His eyes hadn't left the mirror behind the bar, which gave him a clear reflected view of Elara across the room. "I'm looking for a woman. Disappeared about 7 months ago. Her husband, prominent man, influential, he's concerned for her safety. Believes she may have suffered some manner of mental disturbance." "That's so. She's about 5'6". Dark hair. Distinctive features. The kind of woman people remember." Brand turned from the mirror and looked directly at Caleb. "The kind of woman who would stand out in a town like this." Caleb met his gaze. He felt the familiar cold settling into his bones, the cold that preceded violence, that had preceded every terrible thing he'd ever done. It was comforting in its way. An old companion. "Can't say I've seen anyone like that, Marshal." "No? Stillwater's not the kind of place that attracts distinctive women." Brand smiled. It was a thin, knowing smile that never reached his eyes. "Your wife seems fairly distinctive, Mr. Thornton. My wife is from Kansas. A preacher's daughter. We corresponded for 6 months before she arrived." "You have the letters?" "I do. Mind if I see them?" "I would, actually. They're private." Brand finished his whiskey. He set the glass down with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a gunshot. "I'll be in town for a while," he said. "Asking around. If you hear anything, if anyone matching that description passes through, I'd be grateful for word." He produced a card from his vest pocket and laid it on the bar. "The husband's offering a reward. Substantial. $10,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. Around the saloon, conversation had died. Every ear was tuned to the exchange, even if every eye pretended otherwise. $10,000 was a fortune. It was enough to buy a ranch twice the size of Caleb's. It was enough to change a life, and in a town full of desperate men, it was enough to loosen tongues. Brand tipped his hat and walked out. Caleb picked up the card, read it once, and slid it into his pocket. Then he crossed the room to where Elara stood, rigid and pale, near the back wall. "We're leaving," he said quietly. On the ride home, she sat pressed against the far side of the wagon seat, as far from him as physics allowed. Her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. "He knows," she said. "He suspects." Knowing and suspecting aren't the same thing. In my experience, the difference is about 3 days. Your husband sent a single marshal. If he knew where you were, he'd have sent an army. Victor doesn't need an army. He needs one competent man with patience. That's what Brand is." Caleb flicked the reins. The horses quickened their pace. $10,000, Elara said. "Someone in that town will talk. Agnes Morrison was staring at me all morning. She knows something is wrong. Agnes is careful. Careful people talk when the price is high enough." Caleb looked at her. In the fading light, she seemed almost translucent, a ghost bride riding beside him through the desert. "No one is going to touch you," he said. "You can't promise that." "I'm not promising. I'm stating a fact." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and in her gaze he saw the beginning of something that frightened him more than any marshal or any wealthy husband. Trust. She was starting to trust him. And she had no idea how dangerous that was. The first week of marriage unfolded in a strange choreography of proximity and avoidance. They orbited each other like celestial bodies caught in competing gravitational fields, drawn close, pushed apart, never quite colliding, never quite escaping. Caleb threw himself into ranch work with punishing intensity. He mended fences that didn't need mending. He broke a horse that had already been broken. He dug a new well 50 yards from the perfectly functional old one, driving the shovel into the earth with the fury of a man trying to bury something that couldn't be buried. The wanting was getting worse. Every evening, she cooked dinner and they ate together at the kitchen table, and the domesticity of it was almost unbearable. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she leaned over the stove. The way she hummed, unconsciously, faintly, while she worked. The way she said his name, Caleb, with an intimacy that felt like fingers trailing down his spine. He began drinking more. Not enough to lose control. Caleb Thornton never lost control. He took control, that was the problem, but enough to dull the edges. To soften the razor-sharp awareness of her presence that cut him every time she walked into a room. On the 5th night she found him on the porch with the bottle half empty, and the Winchester across his knees. "Are you watching for him?" she asked. "For Brand?" "I watch every night. Have for years." She sat down in the chair beside him. The night was vast and star-filled, the kind of night that made the desert feel like an ocean of darkness with their porch light the only ship. "What happened to your first wife?" she asked. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spreading outward, disturbing everything. "She died," Caleb said. "How?" "She fell." The word sat between them. Fell. Such a small word for such an enormous lie. Or not a lie exactly, a truth stripped of its context, a skeleton of fact with all the flesh of culpability removed. "Were you happy?" "Together?" "In the beginning." "What changed?" Caleb lifted the bottle. Drank. "Set it down." "I did." She was quiet for a long time. The stars wheeled overhead. A coyote called from somewhere in the darkness, and another answered, and the two voices wove together into a sound that was ancient and lonely and wild. "Victor was charming when I met him," Elara said. "Magnetic. He made you feel like the only person in the world." I was 20 years old and working as a seamstress, and he walked into the shop and looked at me as if I were the answer to a question he'd been asking his whole life. She paused. "The first time he hit me was 3 months after the wedding. He cried afterward. He was so sorry. He bought me a diamond necklace, and we went to the opera, and he held my hand in the dark theater, and I told myself it was an aberration. A moment of weakness." Caleb's grip tightened on the rifle. "It wasn't an aberration," she continued. "It was a preview. Over the next 4 years, it escalated. The hitting became beating. The beating became burning. The burning became other things. Things I won't describe because the words for them don't exist in polite conversation, and I have decided, since leaving San Francisco, that I will be a polite woman. I will speak gently and move quietly and cook good meals and tend a clean house, and I will bury everything that happened to me so deep that it becomes geological. Layers of rock pressing down on what used to be a living thing." She turned to look at him. Moonlight and shadow divided her face in half. "I know what you are, Caleb." The words stopped his breath. "I've lived with a violent man for 4 years. I know the signs. The way you hold your hands, always slightly curled, always ready. The way the men in town look at you, not with respect, with fear. Agnes Morrison's face when she watched us together. The locked room upstairs that you say is storage, but that you visit at night when you think I'm sleeping." Caleb said nothing. The coyotes had gone silent. The world held its breath. "I know what you are," she repeated. "And I'm here anyway. Because here is safer than there, and you are less dangerous than him, and that is the arithmetic of my survival." She stood up. She walked to the door. She stopped. "But I need you to hear me, Caleb." I need you to hear this and understand it the way you understand the weight of that rifle in your hands. If you ever raise a hand to me, ever, I will kill you. I won't run. I won't cry. I won't fall down any stairs. I will wait until you sleep and I will open your throat with the kitchen knife and I will walk away and I will not feel a single moment of remorse. Do you understand? He looked up at her. In the moonlight, she was terrible and beautiful and absolutely, completely serious. I understand, he said. She went inside. The screen door closed softly behind her. Caleb sat on the porch until dawn, the whiskey untouched beside him, and for the first time since Margaret died, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. What he was. What he could become again. And somewhere in that long, brutal night, sitting under stars that neither judged nor forgave, Caleb Thornton made a decision. He would not be that man again. Not for Alara. Not for himself. But because the man who had stood at the top of those stairs with his hand on Margaret's arm was a man who deserved to die, and if he couldn't die, then at least he could change. At least he could fight the monster the way he'd fight any enemy, with everything he had, for as long as he had breath. It was the first honest thing he'd felt in years. He wasn't sure it would be enough. 2 weeks after the wedding, Marshal Ezekiel Brand came to the ranch. He came at noon, riding a tall black horse, his badge gleaming like a small sun pinned to his chest. Caleb saw him from the corral where he was working a yearling colt. He set down the lead rope. He walked to the house. He reached inside the door and took the Winchester from its place beside the frame. Alara was in the kitchen. She had seen Brand through the window. She stood motionless by the stove, a wooden spoon gripped in her hand like a weapon. Her face blank with the practiced emptiness of a woman retreating behind walls that had saved her life more than once. Stay inside, Caleb said. He walked onto the porch. Brand dismounted at the property line, a deliberate choice, a show of jurisdiction. He tied his horse to the fence post and walked the remaining 40 yards with his hands visible and his coat pushed back to expose the holstered Colt on his hip. Mr. Thornton. Marshal. I've done some asking around. Sent some telegrams. Spoke to some people in Kansas about your wife's family, the preacher and his daughter. Caleb waited. There's no preacher in Lawrence, Kansas, with the last name Finch. No record of an Alara Finch in any church registry, any census, any document I could find. Brand stopped 20 feet from the porch. His eyes were flat and calm. There is, however, a woman named Alara Ashworth, wife of Victor Ashworth of San Francisco, who disappeared 7 months ago under what her husband describes as deeply concerning circumstances. Lots of women named Alara in the world. Not many who look like your wife. Mr. Ashworth provided a photograph. The resemblance is, well, let's call it conclusive. You have a warrant? I don't need one. I'm not here to arrest anyone. I'm here to verify the identity of a woman who may be in danger. She's not in danger. Her husband believes otherwise. He believes she's suffered a break from reality. He wants her home, where she can receive proper care. Her husband burned her with a fireplace poker. Among other things. Brand's expression didn't change. Not a flicker. That's an accusation that would need to be substantiated in a court of law. Mr. Ashworth is a respected citizen. A philanthropist. A man of considerable standing. Standing doesn't make him innocent. And an accusation doesn't make him guilty. Brand took a step forward. I'm going to need to speak with your wife, Mr. Thornton. I can do it here, civilly, or I can ride to Tucson and come back with a judge's order and a dozen men. Your choice. The air between them crystallized. 2 men, 20 feet apart, the sun beating down on the hard-packed earth, every shadow sharp enough to cut. From inside the house, the screen door opened. Alara stepped onto the porch. Don't, Caleb started. It's all right, she said. Her voice was steady. She had the wooden spoon still in her hand, and she set it down on the porch railing with a careful precision that suggested she was managing each movement like a chess piece. She walked down the steps and stood beside Caleb. "I am Elara Ashworth," she said. "I left my husband because he tortured me for 4 years, and I believed, with complete certainty, that he would eventually kill me. I am not insane. I am not confused. I am a woman who chose to survive." Brand studied her. Whatever he saw, the scar at her jaw, the rigid control in her bearing, the fierce clarity in her eyes, it caused something to shift behind his professional mask. A crack, small but visible. "Mrs. Ashworth, I understand. My name is Thornton. I am legally married to Caleb Thornton. Whatever claim Victor Ashworth believes he has, it is contested by the fact that I am now the wife of another man in another territory. And any attempt to forcibly remove me from my home would constitute an unlawful action subject to territorial jurisdiction." She had rehearsed this. Caleb realized it with a start. She had spent the past 2 weeks preparing for this moment, reading the law books he kept on the shelf in the sitting room, constructing her defense word by careful word. Brand removed his hat. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "The law is more complicated than that, Mrs. Thornton. You were married to Victor Ashworth. That marriage has not been legally dissolved. Your marriage to Mr. Thornton here could be considered bigamous and therefore invalid. Then let it be argued in court. In a territorial court, before a territorial judge, with witnesses who can testify to what Victor Ashworth did to me. He'll bring his own witnesses. He'll bring bought witnesses. There's a difference." Brand put his hat back on. He looked from Elara to Caleb and back again. Something was working behind his eyes, not just professional calculation but something more personal, more human. Caleb had seen that look before, on the faces of men who were being asked to do something that ground against their conscience. "I have a job to do," Brand said quietly. "Then do it," Caleb said. "File your report. Tell Ashworth where she is. And then watch what happens next, because I promise you, Marshal, what comes through that gate will not leave alive. That's a threat against federal officers. It's a threat against anyone who tries to take my wife from her home." The silence stretched. A hawk cried overhead. The wind stirred the dust into small, restless spirals. Brand mounted his horse. He sat in the saddle for a long moment, looking down at them, the scarred rancher and the beautiful fugitive, standing together on the porch of a house built like a fortress. "I'll file my report," he said. "What happens after that is above my pay grade." He rode away. The dust settled behind him slowly, as if reluctant to let go. That night, Elara came to Caleb's room off the kitchen. She stood in the doorway in her nightgown, lamplight behind her turning the cotton translucent. Caleb sat on the edge of his bed, still dressed, still coiled with the tension of the day's confrontation. "He'll send men," she said. "I know. Hired men. Dangerous men. I know. You could still send me away. Save yourself the trouble." Caleb looked up at her. The wanting was there, as always, but something else had grown alongside it. Something stronger, something that felt less like desire and more like devotion. He didn't know when it had happened. Maybe it had been happening since the moment she stepped off that stagecoach. Maybe it had been happening since she stood on this porch and told him she would kill him if he raised his hand to her. Maybe it was happening right now, in this doorway, with the lamplight and the darkness, and the immensity of what they were about to face. "Come here," he said. She came. She sat beside him on the bed. He took her hand, gently, carefully, as if handling something precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. "I have done terrible things," he said. "Things I can't undo. Things I will answer for someday. To God or to the devil or to whatever waits for men like me. But I will not let anyone hurt you. Not Ashworth. Not his men. Not anyone on this earth." She leaned into him. Her head found his shoulder. Her hair smelled of sage and soap and the desert after rain. "I believe you," she whispered. And the terrible thing, the miraculous thing, was that she meant it. They didn't run. That was the part of the story that people in Stillwater would talk about for years afterward, the part that became legend, that grew in the telling until it was more myth than memory. They didn't run. Victor Ashworth sent his men 3 weeks later. 4 of them, professionals, armed and well paid, riding into Stillwater with the cold efficiency of men who had done this kind of work before. They asked questions at the copper strike. They showed photographs. They made threats. What they didn't expect was what they found at the Thornton Ranch. Caleb had spent those 3 weeks preparing. He'd fortified the house, sandbags at the windows, extra ammunition stored in every room, water barrels positioned for a siege. But he'd also done something unexpected. He'd ridden to the neighboring ranches, the ones scattered across the valley like lonely outposts, and he told the truth. Not all of it, not about Margaret, not about the locked room, but about Alara. About what she was running from. About what was coming. And one by one, the ranchers had come. Tom Haggerty with his 2 sons. Old Diego Salazar, who hadn't spoken to Caleb in 3 years over a water rights dispute but who had daughters of his own and understood what a man who burned women deserved. Even Agnes Morrison, who arrived with a shotgun she hadn't fired in 20 years and a look on her face that suggested she intended to remedy that. When Ashworth's men rode up to the property line, they found not a lone rancher and his stolen bride but a small army. Weathered faces behind rifle barrels. The quiet resolve of people who had decided, collectively and without debate, that this was where the line would be drawn. There was no battle. No dramatic shootout. The men looked at the fortified house and the armed neighbors and the cold mathematics of their situation, and they turned their horses around and rode away. Victor Ashworth tried twice more over the following year. Each attempt was met with the same wall of stone and iron and human stubbornness. Eventually, a territorial judge, one who couldn't be bought, because there were still a few of those left, granted Alara a dissolution of her first marriage on grounds that would have scandalized polite society if polite society had been paying attention. The scars on her body were entered into evidence. Margaret's journal, which Caleb gave to the court voluntarily, was not required but was noted. They stayed married. Not the contractual arrangement of strangers but something harder and more honest, a marriage between 2 damaged people who understood each other's darkness because they carried their own. Caleb never raised his hand to her. Some nights the old fury stirred in him like an ember in dead ash, and on those nights he walked out into the desert and stayed until dawn. Fighting the battle that mattered most, the one inside himself. He didn't always win, but he always fought. And Alara, who had learned to read the weather of violent men the way sailors read the sky, saw the fighting. And it was the fighting itself, not the victory but the refusal to stop trying, that earned something more than her trust. It earned her love. Cautious, clear-eyed, unromantic love, the kind that doesn't ignore the monster but stands beside the man wrestling it. Years later, a traveler passing through Stillwater asked Agnes Morrison about the Thorntons. Agnes looked out the window toward the distant ranch, the stone house, the green fields Caleb had coaxed from the desert, the 2 children playing in the yard. He was not a good man, Agnes said. But he became one. And she was not a woman who needed saving. She needed a place to stand. He gave her that. Agnes paused, considering. Whether that redeems him for the things he did before, well, that's between him and the Almighty. I just sell flour. The traveler wrote it down. But he couldn't capture what Agnes didn't say, what no words could quite contain. That redemption isn't a destination. It's a direction. A road walked in dust and silence, with no guarantee of arrival, only the grinding, daily choice to keep walking. Caleb Thornton walked that road every day for the rest of his life. Some days he could almost see the end of it. He never expected a plain bride. He got a beautiful woman who forced him to confront the ugliest parts of himself. And in the end, the most dangerous thing she brought into his house wasn't trouble. It was a mirror,